All right. Welcome and happy Monday. Hard to believe that we are halfway through July. It's this year is flying. Gar, you're 2 quarters through with the peer group members, heading into the third quarter. Anything you're really having MSPs double down on and focus on this time of year?
Besides the stuff that's every year, like there's a cycle of business through the year.
Right.
And right now is an important time because making sure that like what were your goals, like not just in terms of, sales and profitability, but what were the big things each quarter you said you had to do? And
Right.
did you achieve them? Pull out your annual plan and recalibrate for the next 2 quarters. If you wait another month or two to do that, you run out of time at the end of the year. So now is really important time. I'd say you should have a day of planning. We're running to our virtual peer meetings next week. So we're going to bring some of that methodology to all the peer members. And then the only other thing that I would say right now is some of the stuff that we're talking about today, right? But also really thinking about, we've been talking about all the tools, right, that MSPs have now and the
Mhm.
complexities. Well, every one of the MSP's customers is in the same boat, and they're less qualified than we are. So, what if you could help your customers look at the tools they have? Are they utilizing them? Who's in charge of them? Like putting security aside, right?
Right.
Because to me, that lays the groundwork for BIAs, right? It lays
Mhm.
the groundwork for potential automations that we can bring them, maybe some BI. So that's one message I'll be bringing next week to the peer meetings is to think about that in a different way. Because the old business that we had, Andrew, it is slowly, not even that slowly going away. We have to think about what our role is going to be as MSPs to SMBs 2 or 3 years from now. It's not going to be the same as it is now. So our lens has to change.
Yeah, you and I talked a lot about even just with automation at Flow, the Roost conference, about where MSPs will be dealing, helping their customers with automation. It's going to be a lot different in a few years. Seeing that as a line, or I shouldn't say a line item, as a business practice in the
Yeah.
organization.
Look, all the things you see me get involved with, right? So, the work that I put on the Kaseya 365, I think that is already playing a massive role.
Hmm.
SaaS alerts, Roost, like these, like trying to stay ahead of where the puck is going.
Right, right, right. Jerry, I'm going to hold off on introducing you, but I'm going to just ask a question, just because you guys have a pretty big lens of and customers, SMBs, and are you post COVID to now, big increase in platforms and tools that customers have, as Gary was indicating, that you've seen, or what does your lens look like there?
I think there's quite a few. I see automation picking up. I see, with the introduction of AI, or more formally, the introduction of AI, we're starting to have folks reach out and ask, where could it help? How could I utilize it? That kind of thing. Tools picking up. But I think post-COVID, there's been a big push for compliance. So there's
Mm,
different federal agencies that have put out new regulations, states that have put out regulations, and compliance tends to drive that conversation, I think, more than anything.
interesting. Yeah, and interesting. What we've heard a lot is, and we've seen is the cyber insurance has been actually a bigger stick than compliance, even Jerry, and a lot of the different things that companies are really doing these days. So
Absolutely. Yeah.
yeah. All right. So let me set the stage. We'll get on into it here. I'm really excited that Jerry and Tim are with us. So, as we know, we've talked about the CDK incident for a few weeks. We talked about it in terms through the lens of Rob Schenk who's an MSP, decent sized platform company that he got his start supporting auto dealers, and the ramifications of 15,000 automobile dealers being down and what it looked like through the lens of that MSP and what his customers are dealing with. And then we kind of looked at it. The following week was, I always harken back to Gary's comment when an MSP, as I said, talked about, imagine if a SolarWinds type incident hit us, and Gary said, the guy said, if that happened, it's not if, it's when. So I kind of used that moniker and said, hey, well, what if a big cloud PSA vendor was offline and 20,000 MSPs had to operate manually for a week or 2 weeks? What would that look like? And are we ready for something like that? And as we closed out last week, Gary's like, it's probably a really good time for us to look at something, that's, we've talked about, but I think we really want to dig into on the CyberCall, which is a business impact analysis. And so,
Yep.
I thought bringing in two folks that really have a very good understanding of what BIAs are, and through two different lenses, right? Tim has been an MSP, he's worked as a CISO. Jerry has worked in multiple high-level roles and holds one right now. So I thought they would be two fantastic guests. One now is Tim looking at it from the vendor side through the lens of many MSPs, and Dr. Jerry Craig, the CISO at NTIVA. So with that, let me get right on into it here. Doctor, thanks for joining us, and it's great to have you. And if you could give a quick intro, Tim right after him, and I'll hand it to Gary.
Sure. Thanks for having me. Good to meet some of the folks on here for the first time, and others I know pretty well. But as you said, I'm the CISO for NTIVA. Been here about 3 years. Prior to that, I was never in the MSP space. This is my first time, so I'm a newbie to MSPs. My entire background is active duty and federal contracting for the Marine Corps and then federal healthcare. So I've got about just over 20 years in the federal space with very large enterprise establishments, and then came to NTIVA 3 years ago to support the SMB market.
Yeah, and thanks for your service, Jerry. I appreciate it. Tim, also a veteran. Thanks for your service, Tim, and
Thank you.
Overview of you.
Yeah, and Jerry, obviously, thank you for your service. It's good reconnecting with you, Jerry, and Andrew, Gary, and Phyllis. Thanks so much for having me. Yeah, former MSP, longtime GRC, FedRAMP kind of thing for the last 20 plus years. And now I went to the dark side to, I really, when I started to get more heavily involved in the MSP space and, kind of helping and coaching and teaching around that, just really saw the writing on the wall. And Phyllis, congrats with 8.1 and the govern function. Yay. Just really seeing the writing on the wall to be able to help the MSPs understand what is actually here now as far as compliance is concerned. And Andrew, you made the point earlier, cyber insurance is really driving this. But at some point from the federal level, and I'm sure, Jerry, you're going to see this as well, that's going to trickle down. It might take a while, but it's good to see NIST and CIS and other organizations starting to understand that we really need to be able to involve our customers and our MSP customers in that risk conversation. So really excited about business impact analysis. It's something we've been talking about for a long time. And I think it's a key, important, and often overlooked step here in the MSP space.
Great. All right, Senator, if you could take it on away, appreciate it.
I appreciate you both being here. Andrew, I've been kind of mentioning we need to do this for a few weeks now. And still enough MSPs that I work with, I think when you start doing business impact assessments, it means you've achieved a level of kind of you're mature enough that you can do something this proactive and business related. So I think it's aspirational to get there, with all your customers. So Jerry, let's start high level and we'll kind of work down. Just talk about terminology, maybe a little bit around the people and process around impact assessments, and maybe what it means to you and the kind of customers you think this applies most to.
Sure. So to me, it kind of means it's a precursor or prerequisite for any type of business continuity or disaster recovery plan, or it should be. I've found in my experience, it's often the afterthought and the thing that folks are doing later, and they've already created the BCDR, which is kind of cart before the horse, right? You're already planning how you're going to take care of your disaster, but you don't even know what your critical assets are. So to me, it's a prerequisite. Terminology, it doesn't really matter what industry vertical you support. I think everyone's either going to call it business impact assessment or analysis. And everyone, I think, for the most part, who's ever heard of it, is in agreement. It's really looking at all the critical assets and applications and people and process to determine, what really is important if we go down, and then in what order are we going to be bringing things back up. I'm sure later, if we dive deeper, we'll talk about things like recovery time objective and point objectives and things like that. But at a high level, most of the organizations, especially in the SMB space, I think probably go into this thinking that they're not as big or as mature, and maybe they don't need these things. And then, like you brought up, a ransomware attack, something like that occurs, and then everyone's scrambling for, well, what should I bring up first? Where should my resources go? And if this BIA had been completed, you would have given your teams a blueprint to just hit the ground running and start making critical decisions. And ultimately, at the end of the day, this is an exercise in explaining and converting risk in a business sense so that the executives understand it and can make good financial decisions quickly. So it's kind of my lens on how I see it. I don't know that it differs too much from industry to industry.
Yeah, that's a perfect way of pointing us in the right direction. And I know when we talk about this, Andrew, with Chris Lohr, he always says the number one thing he sees when they're in, when they're in Right a Boom is more times than not, this doesn't exist. And they're spending time figuring it out. And very often it's too late to be effective, right?
You were literally in my head. It was, Jerry, I love the way you just positioned it, the cart before the horse, because again, there are MSPs that are doing a good job on BIAs, and, do to take that into consideration before business continuity planning. But Jerry, so Chris Lohr, who you may or may not know, is, on the incident response side. And invariably, 99.9% of the time, if you ask him, when he walks into an incident, hey, what are we bringing up first? What's most critical? Where are the most critical assets, et cetera, et cetera? It's typically a blank stare, unfortunately, from both the MSP and the customer. So it makes a lot of sense, your comment of why we're in this world of not knowing.
Yeah, I think Tim can probably also back me up or elaborate on this. I think for most people, it's either you don't know what those critical assets are because you've never done this exercise, or everything is a critical asset to you, and everything's a critical asset. It's the same thing, right? You can't bring everything up at once. Every department can't be first.
No.
So either everyone's panicking because they want to be first, or no one understands who should be first or what's going on. So.
And I think the key aspect of that is, as technologists, we love the ones and zeros and the bytes and bits, but, I've seen so many MSPs struggle to understand how to relate the conversation to the business owner, right? We want to talk about RTO, RPO. We want to talk about, critical systems that we think. But the reality is we might think backups are super important, but the business owner has no idea what the word backup even means. I'm using the term loosely, but doesn't even know what these things, these highly technical things are that we're talking to them about. So I hate to say, dumb it down a little bit, right? And talk to them in terms that they can understand, and that's going to be different for every single vertical and almost every single customer as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I don't even think it's dumbing down, Gary, as I turn it back to you. Gary often does these role plays, which are phenomenal. Gary, it's about talking to them in a language they understand, right? That's really it. If it's in their language, they get it. You don't have to dumb anything down, right?
Yep. And I made a note. I will relate this back. We're going to talk about how we do this for our customers today, but in the end, I'm going to relate it back to the sales process, new logo sales, and then how I would use what we're going to learn today in the process so effective.
We lost your.
Oh, my finger hit the M key by accident and muted me on the keyboard. So Jerry, let's go down one level down now in terms of thinking about this as a practice area. So I'm an MSP and I have 20 or 50, or in your case, probably 1,000 customers. And you want to be able to do this, consistently, like deliver every customer appropriately, right? Based on their complexity. So when you think about the types of roles and resources that you need in order to make this part of the other 50 things we have to do for every customer, how do you view that? Because you're doing it, you have to do it at scale.
Yeah, I think starting is obviously the most important part, right? Out of the gate, you're likely not going to go out and try to sell to 1,000 customers. You've got to, build something that works and something that scales, and test the water and make sure that you've got buy-in and that people are willing to invest money behind this portion of the practice that you're launching. So I think everybody could start small with, a very small team. As much as this is IT and kind of cyber related, I actually think project management is one of the most important aspects of this. When we talk about sales and trying to determine whether this is going to be a T&M effort or fixed fee effort, either way, you have to deliver something that's affordable to the client, that's still profitable for you, you can get done in a reasonable amount of time. And I think focusing only on IT and cyber assets and personnel misses the mark. You certainly need subject matter experts, but I think you need someone that can coordinate and plan, keep things on track. Once you get to that point, you may start with 1 or 2 people. I think it's highly dependent, though, in the SMB space on what your customer base looks like for you, the MSP. Because if you're in one industry vertical like DoD or healthcare, you might get by with a smaller number of people because you only need to go out and hire those resources that understand that vertical. But if you've got 1,000 clients across 20 verticals, their needs, their regulations, their IT, their OT, their personnel, everything's going to be different. And trying to find that one person that's going to understand all those spaces and have experience at the level that you can then go out and charge your customer for that service will be difficult. So to me, it's very much about the processes with project management and finding the right resources. And I would almost say that if you're a larger MSP, you start small, pick one of your industry verticals, maybe the most lucrative or the largest. Start there, build it out, prove your model, and then from there see, does it make sense to expand across? And most likely it does, but then you can start to get some economies of scale.
As MSPs, the majority of MSPs are more horizontal than they are vertically. And in the past, it's because to us, it all looked the same. But more and more, Andrew, not just from a sales and marketing standpoint, but we're seeing more and more that having some vertical expertise where these kind of things start to look a little bit more the same, where we can bring more value. And it seems like each week we find another reason why having some verticals, around, because it leads to compliance and other things. And so you see more MSPs, starting to verticalize in that way. So Jerry, that's a really good point, man. So Tim, let's start talking about, like, from the MSP perspective, some of the, success criteria and what really it takes to get this going with a client in the real world, like for the average, MSP. And, how do they go, like, to market? They're going to charge something for it. Can they base it based on some pull through revenue? How do you look at this? Because this is something you implemented at your MSP.
Yeah, so some of the things that we started to kind of really hone in on, and I love what Jerry said about finding that niche, right? So for years, all we did was federal government work. So we then, pivoted the MSP into doing the same kind of work, but with commercial customers. So we had a niche, right? We had, that kind of specific vertical, and then we had the subject matter experts, which really gave us an opportunity to, first do the work on ourselves, to understand the process ourselves and use ourselves as our guinea pig. And then, approach one of our customers or a couple of our commercial clients that we had that really good relationship with. We could go to them and kind of, I hate to use the word, be a little vulnerable, but go to them and say, listen, we've done this really well over here. We want to figure out how to operationalize this in this particular industry. We have this relationship. So the trust factor was already there with 1 or 2 of those customers, which meant we could stumble a little bit along the way while we figured out the process. Right. And that was really, really helpful. So, and, we were right up front with them and vulnerable, like, hey, we're doing this in this particular vertical that, we know enough about, but not everything like you do. And just that little bit of vulnerability with 2 or 3 customers in a particular vertical, then we were able to really refine the process and then go after other verticals that we were already in.
Yeah. And if you think about this, this is one of those examples, right? And there's others around security where when you want to do this, you got to think about how you're going to get it to your customers. I mean, ultimately, you want to be part of your stack, but it's pretty hard to do until you've done a number of them and you see what the, what it takes to do it. And I'm saying what the levers are, because it's probably not that much different with a 20 user environment than a 50 user environment.
Well,
right? So it's not like a per user. So it really, and when it comes to packaging and pricing, MSPs in general, we're not the best at it. All of them aren't the best at it. So that's a challenge here, right? The commercial aspect of it.
Yeah, the packaging and pricing is always interesting, especially when you're conducting assessments and kind of doing what we might, or MSPs might attribute to time and materials kind of work, right? And this is why, like, if you do 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 of them, not only do you refine your process, but you gain the optimization along the way, right? When we first started doing, in a sense, security SRAs around HIPAA, like the first one was disastrous. It took us, 20 to 30 hours to fumble our way through it. But by the time we were able to operationalize, whether it's a business impact analysis or an SRA, we could do those in like 8 hours flat because we had the experience. And then when we were pricing for that, we knew what it would take us hour-wise. We knew what our hourly rate, FTE, all that thing was, so that we can then price it accordingly and ultimately be less money than the competition because we gained all that efficiency by building the process and iterating over time.
Andrew, I was going to say, I feel like once you get at, like, unless you're in a vertical where they have to do this, you want to go generally to your customers. If you really think about it, and I've been through this with a bunch of our peer members. I went through this process on this and some other things with Keith from DKB. And you start off, as Tim said, trying to figure out, how much time is involved, what's the process, getting it efficient, seeing what the cost drivers are. And then if you have to go out and package it and sell it customer by customer, generally MSPs are not good at that. Right. Or if you're going to put it into your pricing calculator, it probably is a different component. In other words, you have your normal pricing calculator, and then based on maybe big bands of users and other questions, you decide how much that is for the year and make it monthly. And that's really a different way to think. It's different than pricing a tool or other process that we do for everybody. Does that make sense, Andrew?
Yeah, well, I was going to ask you, Gary, how maybe in a Reader's Digest format, because this sounds more NRR related than, that you got to somehow put across your customer on over the year. How do you look at that? Because I know, you are very methodical on roles, process, all the way to endpoints and calculating your margins and everything on something that isn't, as you said, 20 users versus 50. Your cost. How do you get a lens around that?
Yeah. So again, once you find out what those drivers, let me give you an example. When we first started doing like quarterly, for most companies, quarterly restores back in my second MSP, we were kind of selling it, and we could get it to about 20% of our base selling it. Once we got good at it and figured it out, we picked bands and what it took. And when we sold new customers, we came up with our normal pricing for what a seat price would be. And then we would just add on it. Let's say it was 12 grand, like for easy's sake for the year. We would just add on another $1,000 a month to it. And then it was built in. So we had to go through kind of step-by-step logic because it's complex to mix something that's kind of professional services in with all the other things that are process-based within those roles that we do. And then once it costed in, it could be done by, it could be done by the project team, because you can allot that number if that's how you do it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Jerry, I'm just curious, did you guys is it baked in some of the customers like Gary was suggesting, or is it typically project for you guys, or a combination depending how the team wants to do it?
Yeah, a lot of services, using this one as an example, would start off more the NRR project route, until you've refined it and really figured out how long it takes, what the nuances are between the difference of either size, customer, type of environment, industry vertical, whatever the case may be. And then once we were able to refine it, it moves into the same type of MRR model Gary's talking about, where it's something that becomes an annual recurrence. So, maybe you're looking at what infrastructure's changed in the environment in a year. You're going to update this. When you're updating your policies like BCDR, you're updating this. And you're doing it again. You're doing a new risk assessment, new potential, depending on frequency, vulnerability scans, pen tests, whatever the case may be. But you make it an annual or semi-annual type occurrence, and then you just break the cost up across the entire year. And then the customer just knows it's coming at some point in that year, and you align it for their best.
Yeah. If there's customers that have to have it, it's not a big deal. They'll buy it. Like, the packaging is not as important. But if you want to deliver it everywhere, the packaging, like, you can't have our customers making a bunch of decisions like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, makes sense.
Well, and I hate to pull one out of the CMMC book, but the concept of the maturity model, right? So, you start, good, better, best, right? And that maturity model of being able to mature the customer's posture over time based on, 2 or 3 or not a lot of SKUs within your MSP, right? To be able to move them and progress them to a better defensible, safer, more secure environment in the long run. We were very selective in the customers that we brought in because we didn't want to jeopardize our federal work. And so it was non-negotiable. You're doing a BIA, you're doing risk assessments twice a year, you're doing quarterly business reviews. Like, this is what it was part of the package. And we were able to say, good, better, best. We're going to move you. We want you at best, but we recognize you need a path to get there, right? And they were all willing to take that, a little bit over time to get to be the best or more secure or better defensible. So that's kind of how we packaged it, was test the market with a couple of customers that we're okay with, and then build packaging around it.
Yeah, really, that's really good. Before I hand over to Phyllis, I want to make one more point. I saw Keith said something. He said, that obstacles disappear with alignment of technology over time. And that's a really good point. So, Andrew, like, basically that's what I've been teaching, right, for 15 years, is a role of technology alignment. We built my IT process to help people do it, and really based everything around that. And so if you have that kind of a practice where alignment, regular alignment, is at the center of what you do, all of these things become so much easier, not just to do and implement and to manage, but also your customers are already in your culture of that. Right. So these kind of conversations become so much easier when you do that.
Does it also allow you, Gary, in sales cycles, when you were selling to, in Tim's model of a maturity model, to say, this is what good looks like, for companies like other attorneys or law firms like you, or construction companies, or whatever it may be, this is what good looks like. Let me show you how we get companies there.
Yeah. And let me tell you what our cutoff of the least good you can be and work with us is.
That's key.
Yeah. Right. And you kind of alluded to that. Like, there's some minimum standard we have to get everybody to, and here's what's involved in getting there. Not just paying us and our cost, but changes you need to make in your organization. If you're not willing to do that, you can't be our customer at any price.
Right.
Yeah. And I think, and Gary, you make a really solid and valid point. A lot of MSPs won't refuse to bring on a customer. They're like, ooh, new MRR, gotta have it. But that might not be the right customer for you, right? And it's scary to say, like, I turned down a lot of work because they weren't willing to align, right? And we love that align word, to where we wanted to help them get to. They just weren't willing to follow that alignment path. And so we refused to take them on as a customer. Like, hey, there's another 500 other people in the space that could do the work. We weren't willing to bring on that own risk to ourselves.
Yeah, and Jerry, if you think about it, I sit on the boards of a couple similar companies like NTIVA that are scaling and doing acquisitions. You're really buying customer bases, and so like from where you sit, having all customers meet a minimum standard and delivering similar things like this to every one of them, it's almost non-negotiable, or you can't scale. Maybe smaller MSPs haven't figured it out; they just get stuck and they don't know why. But does that make sense?
It does, and I think it's a challenge. I mean, I've heard it from the day I entered the MSP space 3 years ago, especially on the sales side. It can be a challenge. I think one of the ways MSPs can introduce this service would be not adding it as yet another SKU. So it's another product that someone has to go out and sell, incorporate it into a service you already have, like in our case, the virtual CISO service, so that when someone signs up for virtual CISO hours, all they have to do is pick a bucket of hours, per month. They can increase that over time, but there's a portfolio of services that come along with it. And then you're not going back to them each and every time. Now I have a risk assessment. Now I have I want to do some type of IT assessment. Now I want to do an SIA. No, it's just, you already have our service. It's already included. We just need more hours to be able to service you better. And as they mature, as they grow, they can just increase those hours and they don't have to change anything else. And I think it's easier from a sales process because you're not actually going back and selling anything.
Yeah. So Andrew, this is really good. Like when you hear people who are running businesses at scale, it's good for everybody else to hear, because the thought process, the methodology, you want to start to incorporate this kind of logic as early as you can if you want to be able to not get stuck.
Yeah, absolutely. I love Jerry's point that this is, the end result you're going to is a practice area. Again, Gary, which aligns to what you talk about. There's a role for this, right? And then there's things underneath that role.
All right, now I'm going to stop yapping and get over to Phyllis.
Yeah. Hey, Phyllis, good to see you. Thanks for joining.
Hey, great to be here. No, this has been really great conversation. So, Jerry, you talked in the beginning, a lot of times clients have no idea, what it takes to bring their business or run their business, and what are their critical processes, what are their, where's their critical data, what IT systems do they heavily rely on. So let's say, you're engaging with your customer, you want to whiteboard this for them, and you're going to, put it up for display so they can see. Can you talk with us, like what kind of questions are you asking them around like the potential financial, operational, and reputational and regulatory impacts to help them understand, hey, this is where you are at risk, and these are the kinds of things you should be thinking about?
Sure. So that one's a large one. So I would say before I've even engaged the customer, because they're already a customer, during the prospecting process, you're going to find out, typically what industry verticals they're in, if it's one or more, what kind of customers they support, their size, complexity. You're going to know stuff about them, obviously, before you engage with this. So some of that I'd go into it already knowing. I'd, maybe double check on compliance requirements, federal regulations. They may not be aware that new regulations have come out in their space and they now have to adhere to things. Cyber insurance, whether they have it and want to reduce premiums and deductibles, or they're looking to get it and they're not sure if they can even qualify and what the cost would be. Like a lot of areas to start the conversation. But once you get to the whiteboarding piece, I think the part that's most often left out is it's not that the customers don't know what's important or critical to them. It depends who you ask at the customer site. So if I've got a 50-person company, finance likely has either a server, an application, data, whatever it is that's critical to them to do their job. Marketing is going to have something. IT is going to have something. Just depending on the size of this company, right? So each group or each department that you ask is going to have their own critical applications, people, processes, assets. And they're unlikely to know what the other critical assets for other departments are. So if you go into it with just what does one person's view look like, you're going to come out with one or two items. And I think what most C-suite miss is that you might have 10 departments and 30 different critical assets and people and processes. And this SIA process is what allows you to dive in and get stakeholder feedback and get everyone a voice at the table, so they can say, this is what's important to me. And then you can start asking those questions. How long can you be down before you can't work before you go bankrupt. And then you can start to prioritize. But if you're just taking in the, if you go work with 1 or 2 people and ask them to speak on behalf of the whole organization, they'll likely miss, I don't know what percentage is, 50% or more of their critical assets.
And that's even in a small business, Phyllis. Like you're dealing with someone who has, 20 to 50 employees on a small scale. There's different people doing all those same functions. They might not be departments, but I think the same logic applies in businesses of all scale.
And data specifically, I didn't touch on that one. When you start as a small business, cost is obviously extremely important. You're not going to go out and buy 5 servers or 5 different storage solutions, for 5 different departments. You're going to co-locate data because it's cheap, easy, fast. As you grow, though, we get a lot of clients that come on that have to meet a certain requirement, like let's say CMMC, and we say, well, where is that data that we have to protect? It's everywhere. Because it's just how you grew, and you never got to the scale of let's go segment our data. So again, if you're going to go put a BIA in place, how do you do that if you don't know where the data is and who's accessing it?
Phyllis, Tim had a great question in chat. Tim, I think it's an awesome one. I'm not sure if your question was around, specifically like where he's high, we're high level. How do you actually do a BIA? If we have some time, Jerry and Tim, can we talk about an example of a step in the process, and quote unquote, how you do it? I'm not sure we'll have time today, but maybe we do a whole, literally, if you guys would be open to coming back, we talk about that in and of itself. And then he had another question of Jerry, the term SIA. If you can
security impact assessment. So you've got PIA for privacy. The IA is always pretty much the same, but whether it's privacy, security, business, and each one has a focus on something different. So whether it's data security in general, business impact, but ideally you're gonna run all these. I know we're talking about BIAs today, but they each are in their own kind of lane and tie in together.
It's funny that you mentioned these acronyms, and we've been dealing, I'm sure, Jerry, you have as well, for years at the federal level, starting to see these things trickle down into the MSP and into the SMB space is refreshing but terrifying, right? Because you saw somebody like, how do we do this work? Well, that depends. And hopefully, Andrew, we'll be able to get to that at some point or on another call. I think that's the whole premise of what we're trying to talk about here, is making sure that there's enough awareness that these things exist. They have existed for a long time. They are tools to help your MSP eventually help your small businesses, right? Andrew, I don't know if you're going to share the ready.gov one after at some point, but there's a template like everything else in the world these days.
Yeah, no, Tim, if you could throw it in the chat that while Phyllis, I think Phyllis got another question for.
Yeah, go ahead.
For Jerry, that'd be awesome. But I think, Tim, the end result is, again, like we've said, once you get a little bit of a, as Gary likes to use the acronym, on the fairway of, okay, this is step 1 in the process, which is identifying your critical assets and things like that and data. You start internally, right? And like most things that we do, we want to be at least to go, wow, again, I'll come back to Gary. Wow, that took us, I'm making it up, 50 hours. We did a special project this quarter. That's what he typically recommends to his 500, 600 plus peer members now. Maybe it's more. There's a special project. Okay.
650.
Huh?
650.
Okay. And then from there, Tim, it would be, okay, we're going to then start to try to do this on a few customers, and and I think, Gary, you can exclamation point this. It's expensive early on because, you're figuring this thing out. But once you get past the 5 and 10, and all of you all know this, that's where scale comes in and process. But
listen, I'm going to say this, and not just saying this because I run the biggest and most awesome peer group in
do you really have to say that, Gary? I think we already all know that.
Yeah.
Jealous.
Everyone, this is the reason more than ever, every MSP needs to be part of a peer group, right? Because there's so many of these things. Andrew, in the time we've been doing this show, think how many things MSPs have already had to learn and implement. Yeah. And at all levels. Even the larger companies, we're putting together like an aggregator group right now because it's the same thing. And, Tim, you mentioned like these terms come from other places and slowly they take hold. And getting down the line on these things before your competition, we'll talk about how it impacts sales, but it's also going to protect you from churn.
Or whether
not the old days where we could just sit and do whatever we wanted and things move slow. It affects us now. Like not doing things is a decision in the MSP business.
Well, and Gary and Phyllis, sorry, one last thing.
Sorry, Phyllis. I'm all fired up today.
No, I mean, I like it.
But for years, right, we I think we were early on 5 years ago talking about doing tabletops as an example, Gary, and doing incident response plans. And I think, we hope we helped a lot of people start to get, we did special projects. We have a whole template that Mike Begard did and sanitized. My point simply was, all of a sudden, now you have some cyber insurance policies, depending on size and scale, that is now a requirement. It's not, hey, it'd be nice to have. It's, if you want this level of coverage, right, at this rate. And so I think that's what, the point of maybe bringing up the BIA today. And Jerry, again, I really appreciate you talking about it being the cart before the horse, because everybody is doing business continuity planning, we hope, with their customers as an MSP.
Jerry's kind of saying, I don't think you're really doing it if you haven't done this first. He was trying to say it in a nice, but he's saying it in a nice way.
Jerry doesn't always have to say things in a nice way. I've been with Jerry before.
Going out on the internet, this is a different Jerry.
Okay.
Well, you make a valid point. Like, how can you determine what it is that you want to protect? Like, maybe, we didn't even get into RTO and RPO and uptime objectives and all the fun things that literally, are part of this process, right? Like, when I did this for one of our customers, they didn't care about email. I could walk down the hallway and unplug the Exchange server for 3 days, and they didn't care because 90% of their business was on the phone. And so as long as the phone system ran, they didn't care about email. I mean, that's obviously flipped in these times, but, as long as the phone worked, they didn't care about email. And so that if I didn't have that conversation and I was worried about backups and uptime and redundant servers for all the Exchange environment, but I didn't pay attention to the phone system and that went down, I probably would have lost the customer plus a bunch of other things. That's all goes back to having the conversation with your client and asking from them, what makes you money? And how can we help make sure the top 3 things that make you money, we're covered,
right?
We're protecting.
Well, speaking of RTO and RPO, that's my next question.
Good segue.
Yeah, so we all know about RTO and RPO. So, Jerry, can you walk us through that questioning? And so if there's a gap of, from where they are now and actually what they're telling you, what has to happen to get your client to actually spend money to get where they need to be? So, for example, if we see missing MFA on these critical systems that they say are must have, I mean, we all know about Snowflake at this point. What is it that you can do to help those small, medium business understand, like, hey, here are the BIA gaps you need to fill, and it actually is going to cost some money?
So this one's a good question because it's going to tie into a comment that I was going to make before we moved on to this question, which was, I know from an MSP space, folks that might be listening who have not done this work before might be thinking to themselves, I need to get into this space because if not, someone's going to steal the work and the customer from me. And this is another revenue stream. And the sales, money, financial aspect of it is very real. I get that. I don't think that should be the motivating driver of why you're doing it. Because I think one of the things that happens, and RTO and RPO are great examples of this, is that if you're not experienced in the space and you don't learn and you don't understand it, you're not going to ask all of the other questions and understand the direct and indirect results of things that come out of this process. So as an example, with RTO and RPO, if you sit down with a client, and most clients are not going to know what the time value should be. They're looking to you as the expert to tell them what's reasonable, what's industry best practice. If you say, for example, okay, I think this critical system needs to be brought back up within 4 hours. And they say, that sounds great. Let's document that in our BCDR. Perfect. As the MSP, what if your SLA for even responding to their incident is 8 hours? Then by default, you can still meet your SLA, but below their RTO. So you're not really providing them value if you don't even call them until hour 5, even though you think you're doing a great job and you're 3 hours faster than you need to be. So I think understanding that, again, it's not just picking a random number out of the air. There has to be tied back to, can you as the MSP service them in a way that they can meet these objectives? And maybe natively you can, maybe you can't. Maybe you have to increase cost. Maybe you have to bring on different people. You have to structure your business different. So there's always a way to meet their needs, but it doesn't mean that the way you provide it out of the box will. And on the client side, they have to understand what is the cost that comes to them. It's no different than when you sign up for any type of plan for 1 hour response, 2 hour response. You pay more because the company that services you has to be available. So as a client, you can pick the number 4 out of the air, but do you realize that there are costs that are associated with that? And the person who's doing the BIA has to be experienced enough to understand what those are, articulate it to the customer, and then let the customer go back and say, is this truly within our budget, or should that 4 hours now become 24 hours?
Jerry, you bring up a really good point. Gary, I'm just going to throw this to you. I wish like an Eric Tillage was on for legally, but man, I could see that being, as you say, have a lot of hair on it. I mean, your SLA is one thing in your agreement with your customer. And then, let's just say you did, we did our business continuity planning with it. And it says, and those are dichotomous things. You could find yourself in a world of trouble, couldn't you, Gary, in a down situation?
Yeah, absolutely. And so one of two things has to happen. If you're where Jerry and team is, you can figure out what you have to do, whether it's a cost process issue, to be able to separate and meet those for each customer, or the customers maybe have to be different kind of customers that are willing to meet you with how you're set up today, because you might not be in a position to be able to change that, but it's got to be one. It should be one or the other. You should at least know. Let's start with that. Like,
it's probably a good reason to go back and for alignment even. Hey, we're looking at our annual agreements. We noticed this. You told us this about your core business system. I got to believe it should be in that process, shouldn't it, Gary?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, if I can, so one of your viewers had added a comment about value, right? You want to add value. This is a way I think that you add value as a subject matter expert. When you can go introduce these topics and explain this in a business case analysis to a C-suite, you bring value. And you can say, for example, I'll use someone like an Amazon. How long, how many dollars per hour does Amazon lose if their website goes down?
Right.
If you don't know that for your business, whatever that example happens to be, you really can't answer the question, how long can I afford to be down? So again, if I'm just the standard CISO coming to you saying, well, as part of this exercise, you must set an RTO and an RPO, and we're going to reuse that in your BCDR plan, your client's just going to say, well, what do you recommend? And you say, well, 24, 48, 72 hours. But you haven't provided any value. The value is really in, can your business withstand 72 hours of being down? Can we as your MSP get you back up in that amount of time? So again, I think one, you have to be educated and experienced enough to bring up all these points and educate your client. Once you educate them, I think then on the cyber insurance side and what a lot of folks use with fear tactics, you can get rid of the fear.
Right.
Yeah.
If they understand their business can't survive more than 72 hours, then what do I need to spend to make sure I don't go down for 72 hours?
The other point, Phyllis, is I want to turn the questions back to you. That if you guys want this, just let me know and I'll get it out to you. Ryan Weeks in the first Right at Boom did something Jerry called BCDR at scale, which was, what if all your clients needed to be up in 72 hours, and there was a ransomware attack on you as a MSP or 10 of your customers. So it's one thing to just look at it through the lens of one customer.
Right.
So
that was an eye opener.
Yeah,
you could have 50 plans, all at which can work, but they can't work all at the same time for a bunch of different reasons: resource, process, bandwidth. There was a whole bunch of things that were constraining resources.
Yep. It was great. All
Well,
right. Phil.
and one thing to add to that comment is,
Yeah.
what if your clients truly could have been down for 96 hours without an issue?
Yeah.
But you as an MSP providing this service were writing 24 hours in all of their documentation because you thought you're doing good for them, and then you've painted your MSP into a corner where I can't actually do this. What happens if 3 out of 50 go down? I can't actually meet my obligations. So you better hope you're real lucky and they go down one at a time.
Yeah.
And
Right.
that's exactly what happened with, we always thought email, most important, most important, most important. And until we had the conversation with the customer around, we don't care about it. Go unplug it. As long as you have copper phone lines and we can place phone calls, that's all we cared about. And so, and we had to modify that customer by customer, right? So it's not just a one size fits all solution, right? Granted, now with Office 365 and other things, like if we didn't have that conversation, we would have made the assumption that email was the most important. And had we moved them to VoIP back in the day when it still wasn't solid as it is now, well, more solid as it is now, and it was down, they would have lost so much business because they couldn't place phone calls. But yet email was running. So just taking some of those your own internal assumptions doesn't necessarily apply blanket across every one of your customers.
Right. Good point. All right, Ms. Phyllis, I know we're taking all your time here.
No, this is fine. I'll just ask Tim one last question, and I'll turn it over to Gary. So, Tim, you get to look across different MSPs, how well they're doing with BIAs and other assessments. So what's the difference between an MSP that's just doing, onesie, twosies and assessments versus an MSP that's capable of doing like tens or hundreds?
The amount of money that they're able to make across that because they can do that work at scale. So realistically, once you've defined that process and learned what works really well in your MSP, then it's a matter of replication and I hate to say the economy of scale, right? You're able to do that work quicker, more efficient, understand what's going on in your customers, and then continue to tailor the conversation. Because today it might be the phone system, but this ongoing continuous process of figuring out where those crown jewels are may shift from time to time, right? And so continue to do that work gains you the efficiency, which makes you more money in the long run.
So I have a kind of a follow-up question to that. So let's say there is a big change in an organization's business, or they move to, I don't know what. What's the obligation? Does the business tell you? How does the MSP find out about that?
Usually after the fact. So the amount of times I was told, hey, by the way, the office is moving next week. Yeah.
Right.
So
it's not like, hey, it's time to update your BIA plan, or time to, let's look at business continuity. Let's look at this. And then you find out, or,
well, I think that's the importance of, people talk a lot about quarterly business reviews. One of the things that we did with our customers was have a 1 hour, once a month check-in at a minimum, period. Right. We just set that as part of our standard. Whomever our point of contact was at the organization, we set 1 hour once a month for that, like L10 style, little more than L10 style stand up. But yes, we did have the quarterly business reviews that were a little longer and a little more holistic in approach. But basically, we gave the customer homework. Hey, for the next 3 months, we're going to meet 1 hour once a month, and then we're going to do our quarterly review. And here's what we're going to discuss for the next quarter. Sometimes we even had customers that we did 1 hour once a week or half hour once a week. So we were always in the forefront of being that technical expertise to help them and learn about the things before the fact as opposed to after the fact.
Okay.
If I could add to that, I think one other item would be whether you find out after the fact because the customer made a change without your knowing, or if you're really embedded with them and you're the one making it. Maybe it's a pro serve team that's deploying a new server or a new service, whatever the case may be. Really, in your processes, there should be a triggering event and checklist that says, if this occurs, I now should go update my SIA, update my asset inventory, update my software library, update my risk assessment, my policies. But it should at least trigger someone somewhere in the process to say major change occurred in the environment. which downstream affects all of these things should be reviewed and looked at. And anywhere that, if you come up with a 10 item checklist of things that need to be updated, and a customer only has 6 out of the 10, there's yet another sales opportunity to say, you should have those other 4. And once you have them, we'll update them for you when this next major event occurs.
Exactly. And Jerry, that led to a question I was going to ask you, which is, there's these changes, as Tim said, on the customer side, but there's changes on our side. There's regulatory changes. So so part of this is someone's got to be aware of that and training whoever is delivering this, if it's a person or a team of people. Like, there's got to be a training component to this, right?
Mm-hmm. There does. I think you have to have one or more people who are trying to stay on the forefront of learning what are all these changes that are coming, and there's just so many of them. There's a lot of resources out there to try to follow them. Obviously, the more industry verticals you're in, the more difficult it is. I don't know that there's so much training, like take a class, take a certification. I don't know that it's that.
No, internal training.
Yeah, internally, I think once you've gotten what we're all looking for, which is kind of a cookie cutter process and templates and everything, and the pricing worked out, you're making minor modifications. But I think internally, more of the training is an education to the rest of the organization that practices and processes and procedures have to change to accommodate these regulatory changes. And here's what they are. Here's how you have to modify your behavior. Here's how you have to, if you deploy a new switch, it's got to come with certain security requirements baked in out of the gate, or you're going to make your customer non-compliant. That type of updating and training and teaching and education, I think, is really important. Just, it's nothing formal.
Yeah. Andrew, I know we're coming up to the top of the hour, and I want to make sure one point that I made is, look, this is a great example of something, not an easy thing, right? If you're not doing it today in your MSP, from what you heard today, it's not easy, but you can get started and you can work through the process. Once you do, and you're doing it for the majority of your customers, and you've been through seeing what it's like to get there, now, when you're in front of a new prospective customer, you're asking questions that relate to this, that in almost all cases, they will not be able to answer because their current MSP has not gotten there yet. It's, again, every time we add something on, it's another huge wedge because our self-image changes. What we know and believe is the baseline for all SMB changes. And so on one side of it, this is why the most mature operationally and security-wise MSPs sell the most recurring revenue at the highest price. But the other side of it is, because more and more people are getting there, if you don't, someone's going to knock on your customer's door and they're going to ask them these questions. And if they come to you, you're not going to be able to say, oh, well, we'll do it for you. Because the MSP just explained. You just don't flip a switch and do it. Here's the process we got through to get here today.
Yeah.
It's critical.
Yeah. And it's a great you can use those questions in an oxymoron type questioning, which is, hey, when your current if I was Jerry, hey, when your current MSP, prior to making sure your backups and continuity planning was all ready, walk me through how they sat down with you and looked at business impact, and they kind of outlined for them what was most critical for revenue, and they're sitting there going, my MSP never did that, and I'm sure you've seen that, right, Jerry? When you probably went in early on as your early days at NTIVA, coming from previous roles and saying, okay, so when you did this, and they're like, we didn't do that, right?
Yeah, and in the federal space, whether it was DoD or healthcare, we used kind of the crawl, walk, run model. Here we align with good, better, best. I think the message I would give most MSPs is, if you're going to dip your toes in this like any other service, look at it like a crawl, walk, run. And if you know your customers well, and your customer base, very few from a percentage perspective have BCDR plans, and very few have ever done a BIA, then just put out the crawl piece first. Give them something. Going into an assessment, show the gap, show the benefit and the value of your service. Get as many customers up to that level, like you talked about, like if MFA was missing, get as many customers up to having it. A year down the road, you can move to that walk or better phase. And over time, you put together what good, better, best looks like. Not everybody will mature to best, but at least have a path. And when they get to one, they can say, now what more should I be doing? And you say, well, now here's some more advanced things you should do. Don't try to out of the box give them everything. They won't be able to digest it anyway.
I was going to say something really sarcastic in closing, Jerry, which was, I wonder how Snowflake's feeling right now about going backwards, crawling into getting a bunch of people to put it on MFA. It's frightening what has occurred from that supply chain attack. Has it not become like mind blowing, right?
It is, but I mean, all of us sitting on the phone here and everyone, participating could probably say how many clients still aren't doing it. How many
Right.
people still aren't adhering, to what they've seen. So this service will be no different.
Yeah. Interesting.
Exactly.
Well, Gary, I hope this was spot on. It was, for me, spot on with what you were looking for. We had two amazing guests and added, I think,
Really good. I do think in the future, maybe something where we're kind of go through sanitized, example. I think people were kind of wanting us to get there. We couldn't do both in one day, but I think this is an awesome part one.
Yeah, Jerry, Tim, do you think we could have you back to kind of walk through, one or two pieces of it, as so they can understand, hey, this is where to start, this is how you do it? Would you guys be up for that?
Yeah.
Awesome. Phyllis, wonderful to see you, and I'll let everybody know about that, and we'll get back and get this great crew back, and wishing you all a fantastic week ahead, and we'll see you next week. Thanks, Jerry. Thanks, Tim. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.